Hi, Anthony. Thanks.
Hey Alex, it's great to be in conversation with you. As I said in the introductory spiel, awkwardness is kind of one of these topics that um, most people may not have thought about too much, at least theoretically. So it's very interesting that you did, and it's also very interesting how when someone does try to get a grip on these things theoretically, it can evolve into very, very interesting, broad ideas. And inevitably we're only going to be able to cover a fraction of the questions that I've written down on my pages in front of me, but we'll do our best in the time we have. So I thought I'd just start with a very sort of general non-theoretical question, which is, I'm guessing you must have discussed awkwardness quite a lot with your students. Do you feel that there are certain themes that are consistently awkward for them? Do you think that the themes are evolving? Is there a sense in which something was awkward back in 2022 but not in 2024? What's your sort of feeling about awkwardness within the student body?
So I have to be honest, I've been on sabbatical this year, so I haven't talked to my students recently about awkwardness, but I do think that certain things seem perennially awkward. I think, dating is perennially awkward. Sort of that communication stage of where you know someone, but are you becoming friends? What level of friendship have you attained? That kind of communication, like making plans with people, that can get awkward, but that might be me projecting from my own experience. But I also think awkwardness is always evolving and it always will be evolving because awkwardness happens when our social norms haven't quite caught up with our needs yet. And I think that insofar as like social norms are always changing, the norms around things like gender or child rearing or, how you relate to your extended family or how we talk about things like political disagreements, those sorts of things are always changing as they should be, right? And so I think that we can expect the kinds of topics that become awkward to always be shifting. I don't think, to give away the end of the book, that we'll ever get rid of awkwardness. I think it's just kind of this moving target. I'm sorry, I think you are on mute, actually. I lost the sound.
Sorry, I mean, that would be awkward if it wasn't so commonplace. I do that pretty much every time. So I guess, one question that's sort of a little bit further along than I'd thought, but I think we're just going to jump around with the questions is, given what you say, how is awkwardness, how are things ever not awkward? I guess would be one other way of framing it. How can we ever manage to avoid it? What are the kind of strategies we have in place that tends to alleviate or even makes us feel that awkwardness isn't a thing in our social world?
Well, I think, one thing that starts to happen when we think about how we interact with other people, I think that there's often this expectation that like social interaction is just effortless. And, we've all had those conversations that just seem to flow really well, or, you're hanging out with someone and time just flies by. But what we don't realize is how much information is constantly being exchanged back and forth, everything from eye contact to how far away someone is standing to little bits of conversational pause where we're getting an enormous amount of information, and a successful social interaction depends on that, but also like a lot of background assumptions that we bring to bear. And so, it's really kind of amazing how much infrastructure is in place to support those social interactions. And then, we don't really think about it until suddenly it's not there or it doesn't line up, and that's when things get awkward. So, I guess if there's a bright side to awkwardness, it can help us appreciate how successful we often are at these social interactions. But also, I mentioned like, well, we expect it to be effortless, and a lot of the time it is, but it's not always effortless for everyone. And I think that it would be good to kind of realize this assumption that we're making, right? That socializing doesn't require work, and to realize that that's wrong. And socializing can be a lot of work, and social interaction can be a lot of work, and that's okay.
So, one of the, I mean, you list a few characteristics of awkwardness, but before we get onto them, I thought I'd sort of bring up a phrase which jumped out at me as sort of very interesting phrase. You refer to awkwardness as a feeling about nothing. It responds not to the presence of anything, but to the absence of a social script, and elsewhere as a kind of normative negative space. So the way it's sort of this kind of eruption of nothingness into the kind of prosaic everyday world, and in that sense it has this unsettling quality. You say that it's characterized by uncertainty, self-consciousness, and discomfort. So is awkwardness always a problem? Is it something that we will always tend to experience as kind of maybe, I think elsewhere you put it as isolating and an individual failing is the way we tend to interpret it, but I guess you're maybe trying to offer a different picture.
Yeah, so to start with this idea of a feeling about nothing, I mean, I think that this brings out a contrast between awkwardness, which I argue is not an emotion, and characteristic like emotions that I think we often confuse it with, things like embarrassment or shame. So one feature of an emotion, and of course, as you know, philosophers rarely agree on anything, so there's a lot of disagreement about what exactly emotions are. But a lot of philosophers agree that emotions typically have some kind of intentionality, like there's something that they're kind of about. There's like to be sad is to have a sense of loss, right? Or to be happy is at a minimum to like have the sense that something is really good or something good is happening. And that kind of intentionality also directs us, right? So an emotion will have a kind of thing that it's about or a way it presents the world as being, and it'll also guide us towards a type of action, right? um Awkwardness, I argue, doesn't have either of those things. It's not really like about anything, and it's not telling you to do anything. If it's just like the rug has been pulled out from under you and you're kind of lost, right? So in that sense, I think awkwardness is a kind of feeling about nothing. It really is responding to the absence of the guidance that is usually there for us. And so in that sense, it's almost this kind of like, sometimes I imagine, I don't know if you know those old like Roadrunner cartoons where it's like the cliff isn't there anymore, but the legs are spinning, and it's kind of like this moment of just like, oh my gosh, wait, what are we doing here, right? I think there are a lot of emotions that come after awkwardness, and if you or the audience members are anything like me, sometimes when we think back on awkward moments, we might feel embarrassed or ashamed of them, right? Moments where we felt like things got really awkward, that's because we think of it as somehow this individual failure on our own part, that we are responsible for the awkwardness, that it was something that we did, right? That we failed at doing. But in fact, once we realize that awkwardness is a response to the absence of social guidance, this kind of failure of our norms to our needs or to be there when we needed them, then I think we can stop experiencing it as an individual failing and start seeing it for what it is, which is something that points us toward the need to develop better social resources, basically.
While I was researching it, I've only started using Reddit recently. Mainly like if I'm going to like a town and want to look up a restaurant, but I found that there was one quote on awkwardness, which I thought I'd just read a couple of sentences to you because it has an interesting spin. So your argument is that there is no such thing as an awkward person, only awkward situations. And this person goes, my personal mantra is awkward situations don't exist. Because of that, I refuse to feel weirded out, and I believe I can always steer the conversation to certainty. I think it's that last bit that jumped out at me. The idea is that this person feels that the goal of an awkward situation is to then choose to steer the conversation to certainty. So I suppose what that raised is, what kind of certainty do you think this person is seeking after? And is that a good strategy for dealing with an awkward situation?
I had a whole emotional journey as you were reading that quote, because I'll tell you that one thing that's come out of writing the book is I am suspicious of people who claim never to experience awkwardness. And there are people who say this. I had actually a reviewer for a version of the first proposal, and they're like, I don't think awkwardness is a thing. It's just like I've never experienced it. And my feeling is kind of like, if you think that awkwardness is not a thing, that you've never experienced it, that you're unbothered by it, I kind of suspect you have made many people feel awkward. So I was sort of starting from that angle, but then when the person said I steer the conversation towards certainty, I don't know what they have in mind by certainty, but I do think that many of us might know someone who we think is really good at helping to avoid awkward situations, or when things threaten to become awkward, to kind of steer it in a different direction. And I think that's a really interesting ability that some people seem to have, this kind of, because it's not enough to just kind of improvise social guidance. You can do that, right? You can try to introduce a new small talk topic. You can kind of try to avoid the topic that has just made everyone feel really uncomfortable. But you also need people to go along with you, right? So if you try to kind of like break the awkward silence with some small talk and nobody takes you up on that invitation, then it's just going to get even more awkward, right? And so there's almost a kind of charisma involved in that ability to navigate out. Now, I don't know whether this person is as successful as they claim, and I don't know if I think certainty is maybe the goal here, but I think some kind of coordination or some kind of mutual understanding or recognition is what's required to get out of that awkward situation.
Well, I suppose the most kind of provocative element of the book is perhaps this idea. I mean, you put it quite clearly. I think that there are no awkward people, only awkward interactions. And elsewhere, you write, the person who never seems to be able to make small talk, who always seems ill at ease or makes others feel a little less at ease, that person isn't awkward. So this is quite a counterintuitive position. Do you want to kind of say a little bit more about what motivated it? Because another thing that's quite notable is a lot of people these days do self-identify as awkward. It's one of the common ways in which people self-identify. So you kind of want to challenge this picture. So could you say something about that?
Yeah, definitely. And I've been, I think I was a little surprised by how much pushback I got on this point. People seem very attached either to the idea that they themselves are awkward, or to the idea that like that one guy at work is super awkward and so when I was telling people like I'm writing a book about awkwardness, they'd be like, "Oh, great, because I know this person and they are so awkward and I just want to know why and like what I can do about it." So I have a couple of reasons for resisting this idea that there are awkward people. And some of it I think is a little bit uh, strategic. So I think that when my concern is that when we describe people as awkward, a couple of things happen. One, I think describing people as awkward is a little ambiguous between saying like this person feels awkward or this person makes me feel awkward, right? So if I say like Anthony is awkward at parties, it's not clear whether I'm saying like when Anthony is at a party, I feel awkward, or Anthony feels really awkward when he's at parties. And I think that ambiguity is a little dangerous. And I think it opens up opportunities for us to displace our own discomfort onto other people and to identify other people as the source of a kind of discomfort that we might feel in virtue of their presence, right? And I think that this disproportionately affects certain individuals. So in researching the book, I would come across studies on interactions with people with disabilities, and some of these studies were a decade or two old, but they would say, oh, people sometimes feel awkwardness in these interactions, and what needs to happen is the person with the disability should call attention to it early on and kind of set everyone at ease, right? Well, that might mitigate certain levels of awkwardness, but it also makes one person responsible for ensuring that everyone feels comfortable during the interaction, right? And it sort of puts the responsibility for awkwardness and for relieving it onto like the one person in the situation who's perceived as different, right? So I worry that, so that's one reason for not wanting to identify individuals as awkward, but I also think it obscures more than it illuminates. And what it obscures is this point that awkwardness happens when we have a failure to coordinate on a social norm, or more specifically, a social script, right? So when we have this failure to coordinate, that can be because one person doesn't have the social script they need. But I think we have a collective responsibility to make those scripts accessible to people and to both send the right social cues and receive the social cues that other people are sending. And, the kinds of cues that we're used to using might not be accessible to everyone, right? So if we say like, casual cocktail attire, for some people that might be completely clear, like what that means or what that requires. For other people, not so much, or you see this sometimes in like at conferences, or when people kind of transition into academic settings for the first time. It feels like there's a set of norms that some people have access to and others don't, and it's kind of this unspoken thing. And we feel like if we don't know those norms and if we're awkward in those settings, then that's a personal failing. But in fact, it's really a collective failure to make expectations clear and accessible to everyone, is my view.
So I'm interested in the broader kind of shape of this idea of shifting to situations. I mean, you've obviously done it with awkwardness. I mean, clearly there are anxious people that self-identify as anxious, but there are also, as we know, highly anxiety-inducing situations. There are, I mean, this quote really jumped out at me, which I read years ago. It's from a psychiatrist who is talking about someone in a inpatient psychiatric setting, and he writes, a black person on remand in prison was diagnosed by the prison doctor as suffering from chronic schizophrenic illness with an acute exacerbation. He was said to have mainly negative symptoms of withdrawal, social deterioration, and emotional blunting, to be unwilling to have treatment informally, and to be near mute. When I met him in prison, he told me his story with feeling and precision. Soon after I left, he relapsed into the earlier state. So I'm not going to ask your opinion on schizophrenia, but I suppose the upshot of the quote is this sort of situation dependence, that when a black psychiatrist came in to see the black patient and maybe spoke to him in a different way, that in the behaviors changed. And so I suppose it sort of points us to this idea of humans as being exquisitely kind of situation sensitive. So I suppose, what kind of heuristics do we have for determining when something is best attributed to an individual and when something is best attributed to a situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. And I don't know that I'm going to be able to give you an answer to that. I think we are very situation sensitive. I think we're also really sensitive to the opinions and feedback of others. And I think that, that's probably true of some of us more than others. And one of the challenges of writing about something like awkwardness, where there is individual variation, is like, I could say something like, well, we should be less sensitive to the opinions of others, but I think some people should be more sensitive to the opinions of others. And by opinions, I don't just mean like esteem. I mean the kind of feedback you get during a social interaction, right? I mean, we essentially want to be liked and recognized by other people, and that's just a very basic psychological fact about us. So even as we're sensitive to situations, I think we're also very sensitive to like the social dynamics and the social implications of all of our interactions. We are essentially cooperative animals when we rely on our cooperative abilities for survival, but we also rely on inclusion for survival, and ostracism can be deadly, right? So we're very sensitive to those signs of social exclusion, and to the desire for social inclusion. And I think that there's a sense in which other people are part of our situation, but I think that we're very good at reading nuances and variation in those kinds of social settings.
So one of the words you used there was recognition, and I guess something that struck me the more I thought about what you were saying is that the feeling of awkwardness is a kind of a civilizing feeling in a way. Like, you can imagine an awkward situation where, I mean, the one that came to mind when I was reading was Oliver Twist asking for more food. I mean, by doing that, he kind of breaks this extremely strong custom or convention that boys in orphanages don't ask for more food. But I guess the idea was that at that point he gets slapped and sold on to another thing. So there isn't really awkwardness induced. It's like, if awkwardness is present as opposed to anger or violent rage on the part of someone who feels like their norms have been violated, it suggests progress. It suggests some minimal sense of recognition, equality, respect, even care. Would you say that both parties need to feel some degree of minimal care or respect to each other in order to feel awkward? Or can you have situations where someone can be in an awkward situation but really doesn't feel awkward at all?
I think there are people who use awkwardness or take either pleasure or find power in making other people feel awkward, for sure. I think that you're absolutely right. I think awkwardness is in some ways the price we pay for being social, and for being, embedded in a set of social practices and norms and relationships. And in that sense, I think, while it may not be pleasant, there is something, I suppose, good or salutary about the ability to experience awkwardness, right? Someone who doesn't experience it, I would say, is not like a fully socially enculturated being. And I think there is something unnerving about the idea of someone who's just completely immune to any kind of awkwardness, or who doesn't like detect other people's discomfort and respond to it in some way. So in that sense, yes, I think awkwardness is this kind of inevitable product of being a social creature. There was something else I was going to say that went back to something you said earlier, but I think I've kind of lost my train of thought for a second there. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I lost my train of thought a little bit, but yeah, I think, what I was going to say is, in the last few months, as we've been like leading up to the election and in the US and the holidays and stuff, people have sometimes asked, like, well, it's so awkward to talk about politics, for example, like how can we make it less awkward? And to your point about anger, I mean, one thing I sometimes say is like, well, if it's not awkward, what else would it be, right? Because there's a sense in which like having things be awkward might be preferable to like getting slapped or having someone get really angry. And there's another sense in which awkwardness kind of checks certain impulses to certainty or to anger or to things like that and keeps us maybe a little bit hesitant, which is not always a bad thing.
Definitely. I mean, one of the people who came to mind as a well, when I was before I'd read your book, and she does feature a little bit, but not like as a central figure, is Sarah Ahmed, because she's come up with this model of the feminist killjoy. And in a sense, this is a scenario where someone creates awkwardness in order to not allow, for example, a sexist joke or this, that, or the other to go unnoticed because of um, awkwardness. I mean, one of the things you discuss, I think it may be in chapter 4, is the incredible power that awkwardness has over us. So maybe before we discuss Sarah Ahmed and the figure of the feminist killjoy, would you want to say one or two things about the Stanley Milgram experiment? Because I hadn't heard of this one. Obviously, he's well known for his obedience to authority ones, but in this
Right.
case, he was creating an experiment about inducing awkwardness, and it had quite profound effects on the students who were asked to violate social conventions.
Right. So this is an experiment that Milgram did with his graduate students in New York City in, I think, the 70s, where he asked them to go up to a stranger in the subway and ask for their seat. Like pretty straightforward. No one's getting shopped or delivering shops or anything like that. It's just like approach a stranger. And, so I'm paraphrasing, but like he sends them all out and like they all come back and nobody's done it. Maybe one guy did it, right? And if you've ever been a graduate student, like defying a direct order from your PhD supervisor is not, it's not an easy thing to do. So he's like asking them and they're just like, oh my God, I can't do it. It's too hard. So he says, well, okay, fine. I'll go do it if nobody else will. And he has this whole narrative where he recounts like the process of like he's approaching the person and he thinks he's going to faint and be sick. And this is not like he's asking people for $50 or, something huge. But it's just so hard for him to contravene this social norm that he finds himself becoming almost physically ill. And he's like, I didn't even have to pretend to be sick. The person was like going to give me their seat because I just looked so stricken by this act. And it really, that really stuck with me. And maybe we've all had situations where we feel like something shouldn't be so difficult to do rationally, but then, at a kind of basic level, we find it really difficult sometimes to go against what's socially expected, to, to perform some kind of counter normative behavior. And so I think that social norms have a big power over us. And again, that fear of ostracism and really the fear of making things awkward, making things uncomfortable, has a significant power over us, and not necessarily a good one, and can keep us sort of in line or keep us from speaking out in situations where we really would prefer to or ought to. I think when I started working on the book, I knew early on that I was going to be writing about things like racism or sexual harassment, and talking about them in terms of awkwardness. And one concern I had was that that would sound like I was trivializing these things. That to say like, oh, someone made a racist joke and it was awkward, would make it sound like I'm not taking that seriously. But actually, I think awkwardness is really serious, and it can be, enormously significant and really deeply painful and othering and ostracizing. And so that was something that, I wanted to make clear from the outset of the discussion. I think you muted again.
To come on to Sarah Ahmed and the feminist killjoy model, there's a sense in which the joy that the feminist killjoy is killing is the sense of social harmony, that people can do racist or sexist things and expect to get away with it because people are too ashamed or anxious to point it out. And I think it also feeds into the idea which you pick up on in the book, is that women are expected to take responsibility for alleviating people's emotional discomfort and awkwardness. So it's almost like an extra provocation that a woman, in the case of Sarah Ahmed, would actively try to sort of call out these things. So I'm not sure if I have a question so much as any thoughts you have on the figure of the feminist killjoy as someone who emerges precisely in order to not be kowtowed by the sort of paralysis of awkwardness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Sarah Ahmed's work is really interesting and was really important in my thinking about these issues. And, at one point she says something like, the person who creates the awkwardness gets seen as the source of the awkwardness, right? So that the feminist killjoy will be blamed, but, really, and, one of the things I would argue is like, they're not the reason that things are awkward. The reason things are awkward is, the behavior that they're drawing attention to in the first place. I think this goes back to, again, the reason for not wanting to label individuals as awkward, because oftentimes it's really that their presence is making salient something that was already there. And I think that, another point that this draws our attention to is, as I said at the beginning, awkwardness happens when our social norms are no longer serving our needs or have changed in a way, and we no longer have the scripts we need to navigate social interactions. And that kind of change can be hard, and it can be effortful, and it can be kind of unpleasant. Like, I think we hear this sometimes from like older people, like, oh, like now I have to figure out what pronouns to use. It's so hard. And it's like, I mean, it's not that hard, but I get, there is a sort of psychological effort involved sometimes in changing your behavior around certain issues. And Dan Kelly, who's a philosopher at Purdue, has a great piece in Eon about, moral progress can be annoying, right? And he points out like, yeah, it's annoying sometimes to have to change even when you think like you should. And I think that, again, sometimes it's like the presence of individuals gets blamed rather than just the need to make this change. And I know, when I was in graduate school, philosophy was, I think, kind of slow in terms of gender representation. So there were a lot of like all male spaces, and then there would be just a couple of women in these, at these events or in these social settings. And I think there was still kind of a sense of like, oh, well, we used to be able to tell these jokes, but now it would be awkward because there's women here. And it's like, no, like, hey, we are not the problem, right? Like you shouldn't be telling those jokes at all, right? But instead it's like our presence was seen as like creating the awkwardness. And I think in that sense, yeah, the point about the feminist killjoy brings out this very real cost of like offloading the awkwardness onto the individual and absolving yourself of the responsibility to kind of like update your behavior or make that change.
Thank you. So we'll probably have one or two more questions. I can see that quite a few questions have already come in. We'll come to them in a second. I mean, there's a couple more things I wanted to touch on. Firstly, I suppose there's a question around intimacy that we'd probably say that in, say, a marriage, for example, there are a lot of times where you go off script. Like you don't want your marriage to be too scripted by social norms, otherwise it feels like some kind of a Victorian affair. But at the same time, that's not necessarily experienced as awkward. It may be experienced as an
Hmm.
adventure, or you're sort of diving into the uncertainty of deepening intimacy. So I suppose my question is, so what we find ourselves in is a time when a lot of these kind of very strong conventions have broken down. Certain universal narratives have been exposed, and there's a lot less certainty. And in a sense, that there is an opportunity for more intimacy, and awkwardness seems to be the price to pay for the fact that, in a caste system, for example, there's no possibility of intimacy because you're in a different caste. But as things become more egalitarian, you're forced to try and understand more people and where they're coming from. And it does open up the possibility of intimacy, but at the same time, people may not want that intimacy. And I suppose I'm sort of thinking in a sort of an evolutionary sense, because obviously you've worked with ideas around evolution in relation to morality. And is there just a sense in which people prefer for things to be stable and certain, and for certain kind of intimacies to be held at bay? In other words, is it too much to ask for more intimacy than most people want? And in fact, most people want stability, certainty, and they would prize that over the kind of ambiguity and uncertainty that awkwardness foregrounds.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's a an answer to that that would fit most people. I do think the point about like certain relationships and, the example of marriage is interesting. I mean, I do think that when you are, because I've thought about this in the context of friendships and things like that. And I think that the more intimate you are with someone, emotionally, not necessarily physically, then the less threatening awkwardness is, right? It's not that awkwardness won't arise, but when it does, it doesn't feel like this really serious rupture. And I think we're able to laugh at it a little bit more because we know that we feel safe, kind of that will come back together with that person. And I think where awkwardness seems really threatening is in situations where we may not feel as secure in our social placement or, professional placement or whatever it is, where we feel a little more precarious. And then awkwardness really seems like a threat. I think you're absolutely right, though, that, we are now, many of us live in a world where we have a lot more choices in terms of religious affiliation, self presentation, self identification. And so these kinds of tight scripts that might have constrained us before, but might also have served as a kind of external enforcement on coordination and kind of making sure that everyone knows where they stand, those aren't present. And so, you know, the thing about writing about awkwardness is you're like, oh yeah, well, awkwardness, nobody, most people don't like it. We would prefer to like minimize it. But at the same time, the reason that things become awkward can sometimes be very good, right? It's because people have more choice. It's because there are more, there are different ways to religiously affiliate that, for example, rituals around grief and loss are now ambiguous. And we may feel like we don't know what to say to someone who's grieving, which is an example I talk about in the book, right? And that's a case where like it's bad if we don't reach out to other people or feel isolated or alienated in our time of grief because we no longer know what to say around loss and grief, right? Because it's become awkward. On the other hand, like I certainly don't want to be read as arguing like, so we should go back to a situation where everyone has to have the same religion and follow the same religious rituals, right? I mean, awkwardness is kind of the price we pay for a certain degree of freedom, I guess.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. And actually, that was going to be my last question, to look at the challenges. I mean, I know from my own experiences that when people, not very close to me, but quite close to me, maybe are grieving or have been diagnosed with a certain illness, I tend to just implode because of the awkwardness. I don't quite know what to say. I don't know if they want, even the sort of tone, because you sometimes read about people who've experienced diagnoses of terminal things and they say, oh, the last thing I want is for people to come in all
Hmm.
solemn and sort of so you don't know if you're meant to be solemn or and then you don't know if you're meant to ask what kind of affective tone it's just a sort of a mess.
Right.
And so I have noticed that as a big area for me where I actually tend to sort of fail dramatically and almost just don't do it. I suppose hopefully with age I will get a little bit better, but I feel like those kind of very intimate conversations around things like death and grief are areas where I certainly come up against awkwardness as kind of a real stumbling block. So
Yeah, and I think, that goes back to this idea that we expect that we'll just know how to do these things. And I think if you're anything like me, and I think someone just put something in the chat, right? I mean, you might feel a little weird Googling like what to say, right? But why? I mean, we do research on all these other things. You wouldn't just like get on a plane to Paris with no idea what you're going to do when you get there. Maybe you would, and then you're kind of cool, and I respect that. But most of us wouldn't, and yet we would feel weird like mapping out a conversation in advance that was somehow kind of an admission of like failure or something. But in fact, I don't think there's, I think that's kind of irrational, and that's something that maybe we can try to get past.
fantastic. So yeah, there's lots of questions that have come in. So let's start with Pia's question, who asks, how would you characterize the relationship between awkwardness and cringe? That is
Uh,
something you write about, so
yeah, Pia, this is a good question. So I think I do say, I mean, so the first thing is I would say I don't think that I think cringing itself, like, is embarrassment or shame, and that's sort of a retrospective response to thinking about awkwardness. But I take it that you're asking about like cringe, the kind of internet phenomenon. I think that like uh I don't know that I have a great story about cringe. I'm sorry to say. I feel like I should, and I am a little embarrassed to say that I don't. I think in the book I talk about cringe as like you're not really giving what you think you're giving. So there's this like gap between the kind of like self presentation you're trying to give and what you're actually giving. But I also think, and this is based on my conversation with students as of like a year ago, that cringe is something that itself is evolving in ways that I'm not sure I fully understand. So I think it's a really interesting phenomenon. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you. I think I do have a slightly better answer in the book, and I wish I could give you the exact quote off the top of my head. And I promise that is not a ploy to get you to buy the book.
okay, so there's a question from Chris which touches on something I'd been hoping to bring up but forgotten. It is a part of your book, what you call the aesthetic dimension of awkwardness. So Chris
Mm.
asks about the way in which awkwardness has been portrayed in popular film, television, and literature. Are there any films or shows in particular that have been touchstones for you conveying some of these complexities unusually effectively? As I recall in the acknowledgements, you mentioned that your husband is a fan of awkward British comedy. So I would imagine that's one area where this is sort of a common trope.
Yeah, like I think as an American, like we sometimes think we have awkward comedy, and then you find out about British awkward comedy, and it's like, oh, we were at like maybe a 5 out of 10, and then that's like a 10. Like I can't even watch some of the stuff that I know he watches. I think that uh, there is a great, actually, I will recommend. There's a book also called Awkwardness, which is a little awkward, by a scholar called Adam Kotsko. And he kind of starts by talking about awkwardness in this kind of Heideggerian sense, and then does a really deep dive into popular culture. So he talks about like The Office, I think mostly the UK edition. And then he talks about like the films of Judd Apatow. And I think there's one other
Curb Your
cultural sort of
Enthusiasm.
phenomenon though. Yeah, I don't know if he talks about Curb Your Enthusiasm in that book, but anyway, he really gets in, like, does like a close read of some of these comedies in terms of awkwardness. I thought about Curb Your Enthusiasm a lot as I was writing the book, and I at one point thought about writing something specifically on Larry David. I think that Curb Your Enthusiasm is a really interesting example because it brings out this relationship between kind of social privilege and awkwardness, and I think that people are often talking about like, oh, Larry David, and it's this really awkward show and stuff like that. But I think really what's going on in that show is like in every episode or in most of the episodes, Larry is kind of inviting people to examine social norms or scripts which he feels are not serving us anymore and are outdated or don't cover the situations we need them to cover. And he's really inviting people to explicitly negotiate these things, right? To sort of uh, look at them more closely and calling out into the open the things that often go unspoken. And sometimes it's really lighthearted and funny, and sometimes it's, kind of serious, and sometimes it does really make you just want to disappear into the couch. So yeah, I think, there's a lot of pop culture that like claims to be awkward but isn't really awkward. Like Taylor Swift putting on glasses is not going to make Taylor Swift awkward. But I think when it's done well, yeah, awkward comedy can really call our attention to the kinds of social assumptions and scripts that are running in the background.
Yeah, I think my favorite one at the moment is Alan Partridge has a podcast. I don't know, do you know Alan Partridge, the Steve Coogan character? I mean, he plays on awkwardness in a really unbearable way sometimes. So that's the one I've been enjoying.
Yeah.
I see
I
that
mean, and
Chris in the
he's,
chat mentioned someone called Todd Solondz's films trade on awkwardness. I haven't heard of Todd
yeah,
Solondz
those,
though.
I haven't watched those in a while. So those came out, those are now maybe a decade or two old, and that is like a very dark version of awkwardness. I
Mm.
think that I do know Alan Partridge. I think what, someone like Alan Partridge has in common, or maybe someone like Jez from Peep Show, would be like these are characters who we're not going to feel too sorry for because they're almost like awkward in this very oblivious way, right? Like they're not really, you're not like worried about them. But if awkwardness becomes too vulnerable, right, then I think it becomes harder to watch or harder to bear. And I'm sorry, Sally, I actually have not watched Faulty Towers. I don't know it, so I can't speak to that.
That's
Yeah,
one
I'm
for your husband
as an
to introduce
American,
you to.
yeah,
Your
I'm more
next
coming up in the like Seinfeld, Curb Your Enthusiasm, 90s American era. My So-Called Life is another one. If there are any American 90s kids out there, that was yeah, a big awkwardness touchstone, so to speak.
Okay, so we have two related questions. One's from Uzga and one's from the email is Tiopolo, and I know that he's emailed me, so I think his name's Tom. I can't remember, but anyway, we'll call him Tiopolo for today. So the questions are, do you think people feel more awkward today compared to before? And is awkwardness a modern concept and phenomenon? Did ancient philosophers talk about it? Do you see it in Asian philosophy and culture? Is it related to listlessness and depression and things like that? So there's a few kind of similarish questions clumped together there.
Yeah, so I mean, it's an interesting question. Do people feel more awkward today? I think people think that there is more awkwardness today. So I think like people, we often see things like, oh, we're living in like especially awkward times. But in the book, I talk about this letter I found early on, like it was kind of like a letter to the editor in like a issue of Life magazine where the writer is like, "Oh, these are awkward times. I was in a restaurant and the waitress went up to a customer and said, 'Excuse me, sir. I mean, madam. I mean, sir. I mean, madam.'" And, this is from 1927, and the implication is like you can't tell just by looking at the back of someone's head anymore what gender they are, and it's creating all this awkwardness, right? So I think for as long as our social norms and presentations have been shifting, things have been awkward, and for as long as we've cared about getting it right, things have been awkward. As far as ancient philosophy, the translation issues get tricky, and I am not a historian. and I'm not multilingual, but my understanding is like people do use the term awkward or use terms that we would translate into, talking about awkwardness. But I'm not sure whether we would recognize it as awkwardness today. I think though there is this emphasis on or this appreciation of people who have social grace and who are able to kind of socially embed themselves and go with the flow and make socializing seem effortless. And insofar as we've always had admiration for that, then awkwardness has been seen as something to be avoided.
Super. So I guess we could get into a little bit of maybe a quick fire period of the Q&A, just because there's a couple of very pithy questions. So one is, what words cover the opposite of awkwardness? Perhaps grace, which you mentioned now, is a contender, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, maybe something like grace, smoothness. You find the term sprezzatura, nonchalance, right? uh the term comes up historically when the concept of courtly manners are introduced, and this is the idea that some people are just kind of born with it, right? So in that sense, it's designed to enforce a kind of social stratification and to preclude a social mobility, right? That you can't just learn these things, you have to perform them like it's in your blood or it's in your bones or something. So I think there's a kind of style, a kind of nonchalance, a kind of effortlessness that's the opposite of awkwardness.
Okay, so Eileen asks, what inspired you to research this topic?
I think that I was inspired by a couple of things. First, this idea that there would be situations where it seemed like the rational or best thing to do would be to speak up, or in particular, to be critical, to say something critical. And then we would not do it because we didn't want to make someone feel bad or make things uncomfortable or make things awkward. And so that got me thinking about the ways in which social motivations often trump moral motivations and moral reasons. And as someone with a background in moral philosophy, I'm supposed to say, like, that's irrational, that shouldn't happen, that's a weakness of will. But on the other hand, as a human, I really understand that. I find that very understandable. And so it wasn't so much a desire to say that's okay, it's fine not to speak up, but to see what we could say on behalf of that impulse, or to understand that impulse to not want to make things uncomfortable. And I think along with that was this idea that, as a moral philosopher, you're writing about a lot of big life or death moral dilemmas. But for a lot of us, the things that really hurt or that we really feel or that really stick with us are these everyday moments of social exclusion or feeling socially cut down or socially hurt. That for a lot of people will have a really big lasting impact. And I feel like philosophers didn't maybe have as much to say about that as they might.
Thank you. So we have a question from an anonymous attendee who says, so if you're the person with the disability that creates awkwardness, bringing back the point that you were mentioning earlier, how might you suggest navigating that without them taking on the burden, as you said?
So, I mean, first of all, I guess I would push back on a little bit of this idea that it creates awkwardness, or that the person with the disability is creating awkwardness. I would say, I would resist that idea. And I would say that for all of us, when we don't know how to navigate a situation, especially like I think sometimes that interaction can involve not knowing what someone's preferences are. Like, would, someone use the example, I was talking to someone who used the example of not knowing when you're talking to someone in a wheelchair, should you like kneel down a little bit so you're more on eye level or not, right? And I think sometimes it's, just the idea of it being okay to ask, or it being okay to get it wrong. And I guess I would say, for those people who might feel tasked with navigating these things, right? So someone who feels like, well, because I have this visible disability, it's my job to make other people feel comfortable. I would just say, like, push back on that, right? And other people's discomfort is not always going to be your problem. And it's okay for other people to be uncomfortable, and they can deal with it. I also think, if you're going into an interaction and you're worried about awkwardness, sometimes, and not always, but sometimes we can do things in advance to kind of set that up and to um to help ourselves navigate it by doing a little advanced work, right? So if we know we're going to be having a difficult conversation, maybe we send an email in advance. If we know, that some kind of social interaction has the potential to go off the rails, maybe we talk to certain other people in advance and make a plan or something like that. So yeah, I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but yeah. I think there was a second part to it, but I missed the question has disappeared.
Yeah, sorry, I disappeared. I think you covered
No,
like
that's totally fine.
um so I think this may end up being the final question. This is from Josh, who says, isn't the idea of a script too formalistic a concept to convey the nuanced, contextually driven, skilled coping that comes into play when we feel awkward? So that's a nice question
I'm
to
really,
end.
I'm really glad you asked that, Josh. So when I talk about scripts, and this is a term that gets used in various ways in the psychology literature, the sense in which I'm using the term script is not like a fixed dialogue that like an actor might have or memorize, although it can be. And one thing I was struck by is I really like reading advice columns. And a lot of times when people write into an advice column, they explicitly ask for a script. I have to tell my mother-in-law to like stop asking me when I'm going to have a baby. What script can you suggest? And what they want is they literally want like a few lines of dialogue they can use. So there is that sense of script, and sometimes that will get us out of an awkward situation. You're going to ask your boss for a raise, and you go in and you have your lines. But in other cases, script refers to a kind of map that we have to help us navigate social events. And each script might have its own kind of branches, right? So you have a restaurant script to go into a restaurant, and there'll be certain players there, right? There'll be a waiter, there'll be a host, you'll sit down, you'll get a menu. But oh, wait, you walk in and there's a counter in the back. So now your restaurant script kind of shifts, and now you're at a counter service establishment and to go to the front and order your food there. So scripts can actually be very flexible. And an interesting feature of scripts is they can also encode and kind of help us plan for certain instances of deviance, right? So if I'm going to give a lecture, my lecture giving script includes certain things that I'm going to do. I'm going to stand up in the front, I'm going to introduce myself, I'm going to start talking, and certain things the students will do. They'll sit down, they'll take out notebooks, maybe they'll take out laptops. There are norms for what to do at a lecture: take notes, pay attention, don't fall asleep. But sometimes my students contravene those norms when they take out their phones or fall asleep or stop paying attention. I can predict those forms of deviance and I can plan for them. Where things get awkward is in kind of forms of deviance or deviation that aren't encoded in my script and that I don't have a plan for. So yes, you're right. There's a sense of script in which it's way too rigid to help us navigate our social interactions. But that is not the sense in which I'm using the term. Sorry.